Racist cop slaps black woman at a diner. Then learns her husband commands the Navy. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. Naomi Walker had always believed that ordinary places revealed the truest parts of people, which was why she liked small diners more than fancy restaurants, because there was nowhere to hide behind polished silverware or rehearsed smiles, only the quiet hum of conversation, the smell of fresh coffee, and the steady rhythm of a place that served everyone the same. On this particular evening, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky outside the wide front windows painted in muted blues and soft amber reflections from the streetlights. And Naomi sat alone in a vinyl booth near the counter, her hands folded calmly on the table as she waited for a simple takeout order to bring home. She wore a modest jacket and flat shoes, nothing that drew attention, nothing that suggested power or status. And that was exactly how she preferred it, because after years of being judged before a word was spoken, she had learned the value of blending into the background. The diner was modest, maybe 30 feet from end to end, with a row of stools lined neatly along the counter and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years, and the waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, had already poured Naomi a glass of water without being asked, a small courtesy that still mattered. Naomi glanced at the clock mounted above the grill, noting the time out of habit, then looked back down at her phone, resting face up beside her napkin, where a single missed call notification sat silently, untouched, as if waiting for the right moment. Around her, the evening crowd moved in low tones, a couple sharing fries, a truck driver nursing coffee, a family gathering coats near the door, and for a brief moment, everything felt ordinary, almost peaceful. Naomi took a slow breath and allowed herself to relax, unaware that the calm balance of the room was about to shift, not because of anything she did, but because of who happened to walk in next. The bell above the diner door chimed, sharp against the background noise, and a uniformed police officer stepped inside, his presence instantly altering the atmosphere the way a sudden gust of wind changes the temperature without warning. Officer Ryan Cole moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed, his boots echoing faintly against the tile floor as he scanned the room, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid. Naomi did not look up right away, not out of fear, but out of habit, because she had learned that attention was often a liability. Yet even without meeting his eyes, she sensed the weight of his gaze linger longer than necessary. The diner seemed to hold its breath, the easy chatter softening into an uneasy quiet as the officer took a step closer to the counter, then another. And in that suspended moment, Naomi remained exactly where she was, calm, composed, unaware that this ordinary evening, in this unremarkable diner, was about to become the first chapter of a story that would ripple far beyond those walls. Officer Ryan Cole did not raise his voice when he spoke, yet the room still seemed to tighten around his words, because authority does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply assumes it will be obeyed. He asked questions that sounded routine on the surface, where she was headed, why she was there alone, whether she had identification, and Naomi answered each one evenly, her tone respectful, her posture steady, as if she understood something deeper about the moment that others in the diner could not yet see. The waitress hovered behind the counter, hands clasped together, glancing between them with unease, while a few customers pretended to focus on their meals, though every ear in the room was clearly tuned in. Officer Cole took another step closer, not invading space outright, but close enough to make his presence unmistakable, and Naomi felt that familiar pressure settle in, the unspoken assumption that she needed to justify herself simply for existing where she stood. She did not argue, did not challenge him, because years of experience had taught her that composure was not weakness but strategy, and that the truth did not always need to be rushed. Instead, she kept her eyes level and her voice calm, responding clearly, offering nothing more and nothing less than what was required. The officer glanced down at the counter, then back at her, his jaw tightening slightly, as if her calm unsettled him more than defiance ever could. And for a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the low hiss of the grill and the clink of a coffee cup being set down too quickly. Naomi noticed the missed call notification still glowing faintly on her phone screen, untouched, and she slid the device a fraction closer to herself without making a show of it, her fingers resting near it, but not reaching out, because timing, she knew, was everything. Outside, a patrol car idled at the curb, its engine humming softly through the glass, a reminder of systems and structures far larger than this small diner. And Officer Cole straightened his shoulders, his expression hardening as he continued to press, suggesting she had been loitering, implying she did not belong, framing ordinary actions as something that needed explanation. Naomi listened, absorbing each word, her breathing slow and measured, because she had learned long ago that moments like these were not truly about rules or safety. They were about perception and power. A man at the far end of the counter shifted uncomfortably on his stool, as if considering whether to speak, then thought better of it, and the family near the door quietly stepped aside, giving the scene a wider berth. Still, Naomi remained still, her silence intentional, her restraint deliberate, because she knew that reacting emotionally would only feed the narrative forming in the officer's mind. She thought briefly of her husband, not with fear, but with quiet certainty, of the discipline he lived by, the responsibility he carried, and the weight of command that came not from anger, but from accountability. And that thought anchored her, steadying her resolve. Officer Cole finally paused, as if waiting for something more, an apology, an explanation, a reaction that never came. And in that pause, the balance of the room subtly shifted, because power does not always belong to the one who speaks the most. Sometimes it rests with the one who understands what is about to happen next. Naomi glanced once more at the clock, then at her phone, and this time, she allowed it to ring when a second call came through, the sound cutting cleanly through the tense air of the diner, signaling that this moment, carefully contained until now, was approaching a turning point. The sound of the phone ringing seemed louder than it should have been, slicing through the low murmur of the diner and drawing every pair of eyes toward Naomi as she calmly lifted the device from the table. She did not rush, did not glance at Officer Cole for permission. She simply answered with a quiet greeting, her voice steady, respectful, and controlled, and for a brief second, the tension in the room shifted from confrontation to curiosity. Officer Cole stiffened slightly, his attention narrowing, as if the simple act of her taking that call challenged an expectation he had not realized he was holding. Naomi listened more than she spoke, offering short, measured responses, her gaze focused not on the officer, but somewhere beyond him, as if her mind had already moved several steps ahead of the present moment. Around them, the diner remained frozen in an uneasy pause, the waitress pretending to wipe down the counter while clearly listening, a customer near the window slowly lowering his coffee cup, and a bell above the door swaying faintly from the earlier entrance. Naomi ended the call without ceremony and set the phone back down, her hand lingering for just a moment before folding neatly in front of her again, signaling that whatever had been said did not require explanation. Officer Cole cleared his throat and adjusted his stance, the authority in his posture wavering just enough to be noticeable to those paying close attention. And he asked who had called her, framing it as a casual question, but delivering it with an edge that suggested expectation rather than inquiry. Naomi met his eyes fully for the first time, her expression calm but unyielding, and replied that it was a personal matter, nothing more, nothing less. The officer frowned, clearly dissatisfied, yet uncertain how to press further without overstepping a line that had not yet been crossed, and that hesitation marked the first visible crack in his confidence. Naomi sensed it and remained still, understanding that silence often revealed more than words, and that patience was not passive but deliberate. Outside, the hum of the patrol car continued, joined now by the distant sound of traffic moving steadily along the highway, life going on as usual beyond the narrow focus of the diner's windows. Officer Cole glanced briefly toward the door, then back at Naomi, as if reassessing the situation in light of information he did not yet have, but could feel approaching. He spoke again, slower this time, reminding her of rules and procedures, of expectations and conduct, yet the tone lacked its earlier sharpness, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. Naomi acknowledged him politely, her responses concise, her demeanor unchanged, because she knew that respect did not require submission, and composure did not require explanation. A subtle shift occurred among the onlookers, shoulders relaxing slightly, eyes widening with cautious interest, as if they sensed that this encounter was no longer moving in the direction they had first assumed. Naomi glanced once more at the clock, then at the door, not with anticipation but with assurance, because she understood that some truths arrived quietly, without announcement, and altered everything simply by being present. Officer Cole took a half-step back, not retreating, but no longer advancing, and in that small adjustment, the balance of power in the diner recalibrated. Naomi remained seated, centered, and calm, knowing that the moment was unfolding exactly as it needed to, not driven by anger or fear, but by timing, truth, and the quiet certainty that this was never just about a diner or a question or a badge, but about what happens when assumptions meet reality and have nowhere left to stand. The quiet that settled over the diner fell heavier now, not because voices had grown louder, but because expectations had begun to shift, and Officer Ryan Cole seemed to sense it even if he could not yet name it. He glanced around the room, noting the way the customers no longer avoided looking, how the waitress had stopped pretending to clean and simply stood still, watching, and how Naomi Walker remained seated with an ease that contrasted sharply with the tension tightening his shoulders. He spoke again, his tone firmer than before, reminding her that cooperation made things simpler, that situations like this did not need to escalate, framing his words as advice rather than command. Yet the underlying assumption remained clear. Naomi listened without interruption, her face composed, her breathing steady, because she understood that escalation did not always come from raised voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it came from persistence, from pressure applied quietly but insistently. She responded with courtesy, acknowledging his words without conceding anything beyond what was reasonable, and that balance seemed to frustrate him more than outright resistance ever could. He shifted his weight, tapping his fingers lightly against his duty belt, a small restless motion that betrayed uncertainty, and for a moment he appeared to search her face for a reaction that never arrived. Naomi's calm was not performative. It was practiced, shaped by years of navigating spaces where her presence was questioned and her intention scrutinized, and she had learned that steadiness often unsettled those who expected either fear or defiance. Outside, the glow of passing headlights swept briefly across the windows, casting moving shadows across the diner walls, a reminder that time continued forward regardless of the tension suspended inside. Officer Cole asked again for identification, this time more directly, and Naomi reached into her bag with deliberate slowness, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, placing her wallet on the table without opening it, signaling willingness without surrender. He hesitated, as if unsure whether to take it, because something in the moment no longer aligned with his initial assumptions, and that hesitation was not lost on the people watching. A low murmur rippled through the room, quickly subdued, but enough to signal that the audience to this encounter had grown more engaged, more aware that something larger was unfolding. Naomi watched him carefully, not with challenge, but with understanding, because she recognized the moment when authority began to question itself, when certainty wavered under the weight of its own assumptions. Officer Cole finally reached for the wallet, then stopped, his hand hovering briefly above the table before pulling back, and instead he straightened, drawing a breath as if resetting his approach. He spoke about procedure, about maintaining order, about doing his job, yet the words sounded less convincing than before, as though he were reminding himself as much as anyone else. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging his position without validating his premise. And in that small gesture, she maintained control of her own narrative. She glanced again toward the door, not in anticipation of rescue, but with quiet confidence in timing, because she knew that moments like this rarely resolve themselves through argument. They resolve themselves through presence. The bell above the door remained still, the room poised on the edge of change, and Officer Cole took a subtle step back, creating space where moments before he had sought to close it, unaware that this shift, small as it seemed, marked the beginning of an outcome he had not anticipated, one shaped not by force or confrontation, but by truth arriving exactly when it was meant to. Time seemed to stretch inside the diner, not slowing exactly, but bending around the quiet standoff that now held everyone in place. And Naomi Walker felt it as a steady pressure rather than a threat, the kind that came when people waited for something they did not yet understand. Officer Ryan Cole stood a few feet away from her now, no longer crowding her space, yet not fully retreating either, caught between the authority he believed he carried and the uncertainty that had begun to creep into his thoughts. He glanced again at the wallet resting on the table, unopened, untouched, a simple object that suddenly felt heavier than it should have, as if it represented a choice he had not anticipated needing to make. Naomi kept her hands folded, her posture relaxed, because she understood that moments like this were rarely decided by grand gestures, but by restraint, by knowing when to allow others to reveal themselves. The diner's background sounds gradually returned in cautious fragments, a fork scraping lightly against a plate, the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, the distant rumble of a truck passing outside, and each sound felt amplified by the silence that still lingered between the officer and the woman he had approached with certainty only minutes earlier. Officer Cole spoke again, his words measured, almost rehearsed, asking where she lived, whether someone was expecting her, questions that on their own sounded ordinary, yet carried an undercurrent of justification, as if he were searching for a reason to validate his presence in the moment. Naomi answered politely, offering clear information without embellishment, because she knew clarity could be disarming when suspicion expected confusion. She did not mention her husband, did not hint at titles or positions, not because she could not, but because she chose not to, understanding that true authority did not need to announce itself prematurely. The waitress shifted behind the counter, glancing toward the door as if hoping someone would walk in and break the tension, while a man near the window subtly angled his body to keep both Naomi and the officer in view, sensing that whatever happened next would matter. Officer Cole's radio crackled softly at his shoulder, a brief burst of static followed by a voice too low to make out, and he turned his head slightly to listen, his expression tightening as if reminded of responsibilities extending beyond this diner. When the radio fell silent again, he looked back at Naomi, reassessing her with a different lens, one shaped not by dominance, but by caution. Naomi noticed the shift and remained still, because she knew that caution often arrived just before realization. She glanced at her phone once more, not to answer it, but to confirm the time, her movements unhurried, her confidence quiet, and that calm seemed to ripple outward, easing the tension for those watching. Officer Cole cleared his throat and spoke about wrapping things up, about not wanting to cause a scene, framing his words as mutual interest. Yet the change in tone was unmistakable, the edge dulled, the certainty softened. Naomi acknowledged him with a small nod, neither agreeing nor resisting, simply present, grounded, and patient. Outside, headlights swept across the diner windows again, briefly illuminating the badge on the officer's chest before fading. And in that fleeting reflection, the contrast between symbol and substance became clear. Naomi remained seated, composed and unwavering, knowing that she did not need to rush the truth, because it was already on its way, moving steadily toward this quiet diner, toward this moment, where assumptions would soon give way to understanding, and where the balance of power would shift not with noise or spectacle, but with the unmistakable weight of reality arriving exactly on time. The air inside the diner carried a different weight now, no longer tense with confrontation, but dense with anticipation, the kind that settled in when unseen pieces were quietly moving into place. Naomi Walker remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her calm unwavering, because she understood that this was the phase where outcomes were shaped not by words spoken aloud, but by decisions forming silently in the minds of those involved. Officer Ryan Cole checked his watch, then glanced toward the window again, his movements subtle but increasingly frequent, as if he sensed a shift he could not yet explain. His radio remained quiet, yet his attention kept drifting back to it, as though he expected it to speak at any moment and clarify what his instincts were already warning him about. Naomi noticed these details without drawing attention to them, because observation had long been one of her strengths, developed over years of learning how quickly assumptions could become obstacles. She thought back to the first years of her marriage, when long conversations had taught her the difference between authority that demanded obedience and leadership that inspired trust, and that distinction shaped how she navigated moments like this one. She did not need to mention her husband's role or responsibilities, because she trusted the truth to arrive on its own terms, and when it did, it would carry far more weight than any explanation she could offer now. Officer Cole spoke again, his voice lower, less commanding, suggesting that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, that he was simply ensuring everything was in order, and Naomi acknowledged his words with a calm nod, neither affirming nor rejecting his framing of events. The people watching sensed the shift too, the subtle easing of shoulders, the quiet exchange of glances that suggested the narrative they had assumed at the start of the evening was no longer holding together. Outside, a distant sound began to register, not loud, but distinct, the low approach of vehicles slowing near the curb. Their presence felt more than heard, and Officer Cole turned toward the door again, his attention sharpening. Naomi followed his gaze briefly, then returned her focus inward, grounded in the certainty that moments of reckoning rarely announce themselves dramatically. They simply arrived and changed the room. The bell above the diner door trembled slightly, not from opening, but from the vibration of movement outside, and the waitress paused mid-step, sensing that whatever came next would end the waiting. Officer Cole adjusted his stance once more, straightening his uniform, his expression tightening with a mix of curiosity and caution, because instinct told him that this situation was no longer contained within the boundaries he had assumed. Naomi glanced at her phone again, noting the time with quiet satisfaction, then placed it face down on the table, signaling that she was present, prepared, and unafraid. The officer asked one final question, almost conversational now, inquiring whether someone was coming to meet her, and Naomi answered honestly that yes, someone was nearby, and that was all she said. The simplicity of the response seemed to unsettle him more than a detailed explanation would have, because it offered no leverage, no detail to challenge or reinterpret. The diner door remained closed, yet the sense of arrival grew stronger, filling the room with a quiet inevitability. Naomi breathed slowly, her calm a steady anchor amid the shifting energy, because she knew that the next moments would not require her to raise her voice or defend her presence. They would simply require her to remain exactly as she was. Officer Cole took a step back, creating a clear line of sight to the door, and in that small act, the dynamic of the room changed once more, signaling that the assumptions that had guided him inside were dissolving, replaced by the awareness that authority, real authority, was about to enter the room and redefine everything. The bell above the diner door finally chimed again, not sharply this time, but with a measured certainty that drew every eye toward the entrance, and the room seemed to recalibrate itself in response. Two men stepped inside first, their posture disciplined, their movements controlled, not drawing attention, yet impossible to ignore, followed by a third figure who carried himself with quiet authority rather than urgency. Naomi Walker rose from the booth the moment she saw him, not in relief, not in alarm, but with the ease of someone greeting a presence she trusted completely, and that simple action sent a visible ripple through the room. Officer Ryan Cole straightened instinctively, his gaze locking onto the man who had just entered, sensing without explanation that this was not an ordinary arrival. The man met Naomi halfway across the diner floor, placing a steady hand over hers for just a moment, a gesture of reassurance rather than display. And then he turned his attention calmly toward the officer. Admiral James Walker did not raise his voice, did not introduce himself loudly. He simply stood with the composure of someone accustomed to being responsible for far more than the situation at hand, and that composure carried weight. The two men who had entered with him positioned themselves slightly behind and to either side, not defensively, but with practiced awareness, and the room grew quiet enough to hear the low hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Naomi remained standing. Beside her husband, her expression unchanged, her calm now contextualized rather than questioned. And for the first time since the encounter began, the assumptions that had shaped it no longer had space to exist. Officer Cole took in the scene. The posture, the bearing, the subtle cues that did not require explanation, and his earlier certainty dissolved into cautious recognition. Admiral Walker addressed him politely, asking if there had been a problem, his tone measured and respectful, yet unmistakably firm, and the officer responded with a stiffness that betrayed his awareness that the dynamic had shifted beyond his control. He explained himself carefully now, choosing words with deliberation, framing his actions as routine, as precaution, as procedure, yet each phrase seemed to lose weight the moment it left his mouth. Admiral Walker listened without interruption, his expression neutral, because leadership had taught him the value of allowing others to speak fully before responding, and when he finally did, it was with clarity rather than confrontation. He stated who he was, not as a threat, but as a fact, and the effect was immediate, a visible tightening in Officer Cole's posture as understanding settled in. Naomi watched quietly, not with satisfaction, but with resolve, because this moment was not about vindication. It was about reality aligning itself with truth. The onlookers in the diner absorbed the revelation in silence, some exchanging glances, others simply watching, aware that they were witnessing a turning point formed not by spectacle, but by presence. Admiral Walker asked a final question, whether Naomi was free to leave, and the simplicity of it underscored everything that had come before, because it reframed the entire encounter in a way that required no further explanation. Officer Cole nodded quickly, stepping aside without argument, and in that small motion, the authority he had assumed gave way to accountability he could not avoid. Naomi gathered her belongings calmly, her movements unhurried, and as she stood beside her husband, the room seemed to exhale, the tension replaced by a quiet clarity. They walked toward the door together, not triumphant, not defiant, but grounded, leaving behind a diner forever changed by the realization that dignity does not announce itself loudly, and that true power often arrives without warning, speaks softly, and leaves no doubt when it does. Outside the diner, the night air felt cooler and clearer, as if the tension that had lingered inside could not follow Naomi and James Walker beyond the door, and for a moment they simply stood together on the sidewalk, grounded in the quiet that comes after something difficult has passed. Inside, Officer Ryan Cole remained where he was, aware that the room had not returned to normal simply because the encounter had ended, because eyes still rested on him with a new awareness, one shaped by what they had witnessed rather than what they had assumed. The two men who had arrived with Admiral Walker stayed near the entrance, not to intimidate, but to observe, their presence a reminder that accountability often arrives calmly and without spectacle. Officer Cole adjusted his uniform again, this time with a noticeable care, and spoke briefly into his radio, his voice controlled, his words chosen carefully, signaling that the incident would not simply disappear into routine. The waitress finally exhaled, setting down a coffee pot she had been holding for too long, and a low murmur moved through the diner as customers processed what they had seen, some with relief, others with quiet reflection. Naomi and James did not linger, because they understood that their role in the moment was complete, not defined by confrontation, but by clarity, and they walked toward their car at an unhurried pace, side by side. James glanced at Naomi, asking softly if she was all right, And she answered honestly that she was, not because the experience had been insignificant, but because she trusted her own resilience and the principles they shared. Inside the diner, Officer Cole finished his call and stood still for a moment, aware that the weight he felt was not punishment, but realization, the understanding that authority carried responsibility whether one acknowledged it or not. He looked around the room again, seeing not just faces, but people, each with their own stories, their own expectations of fairness, and that awareness lingered longer than any spoken reprimand could have. One of the men near the door spoke quietly to him, not accusatory, but firm, reminding him that reports would be filed, statements reviewed, and procedures followed, not as retaliation, but as process, and Officer Cole nodded, accepting the reality of what would come next. The diner slowly returned to life, forks clinking, conversations resuming, yet the atmosphere had changed, infused with a shared understanding that dignity had been defended without raised voices or force. Outside, Naomi and James paused before getting into their car, taking a moment to breathe, to let the adrenaline fade, and Naomi looked back once at the diner's glowing windows, not with bitterness, but with resolve. She knew that moments like this were not isolated, that they echoed outward in small, but meaningful ways, shaping how people remembered what authority looked like when challenged by quiet truth. James placed a hand gently at the small of her back, a familiar gesture of support, and together they drove away, merging into the steady flow of traffic, carrying the calm assurance that comes from knowing that standing firm does not always require standing loud. Behind them, the diner remained, an ordinary place marked by an extraordinary lesson, where assumptions had been confronted not by anger, but by presence, and where accountability had begun not with force, but with the simple, undeniable arrival of truth. The drive home was quiet, not heavy, but reflective, the kind of silence that settles when something important has been understood without needing to be said aloud. Naomi Walker watched the familiar streetlights pass by, each one briefly illuminating the windshield before fading behind them, and she felt a steady sense of closure rather than triumph. James Walker kept his eyes on the road, his posture relaxed now, no longer carrying the alert focus required of command, but the grounded calm of a husband who was simply present. Neither of them replayed the moment out loud, because they both knew that what mattered most was not the discomfort they had endured, but the clarity that had followed it. Back at the diner, long after they had left, the encounter continued to echo in quieter ways, in the way the waitress spoke a little more confidently to the next customer, in the way conversations paused before judgments were formed, and in the way Officer Ryan Cole sat alone at a booth, staring at the surface of the table as if seeing it for the first time. He did not feel anger or humiliation, but something more unsettling, the realization that assumptions had guided his actions more than principles, and that recognition lingered far longer than any external consequence could have. He understood now that authority without awareness was fragile, and that respect could not be demanded, only earned through restraint and fairness. Reports would be written, reviews conducted, procedures examined, but the deeper shift had already taken place, quietly, internally, where accountability truly began. Naomi and James arrived home and stepped into the familiar comfort of their living room, a space untouched by the tension of the evening, and Naomi set her bag down with an ease that signaled she was ready to let the moment rest. She thought about how many similar encounters never reached a turning point, how many ended without witnesses or acknowledgement, and that thought did not fill her with bitterness, but with resolve. James poured 2 glasses of water and joined her on the couch, and they shared a brief look that required no explanation, because they both understood that standing firm did not always change the world all at once, but it could change one room, one moment, one set of assumptions at a time. The night continued on as nights always did, ordinary and unremarkable on the surface. Yet beneath it lay a quiet truth that dignity had been upheld without shouting, without force, without spectacle. Somewhere across town, the diner lights dimmed as closing time approached, and the space returned to its usual stillness, forever marked by an evening when power was challenged not by aggression, but by calm presence. Officer Cole eventually stood, paid his bill, and stepped back into the night, carrying with him a lesson he could not unlearn, that the badge he wore was not a shield against reflection, but a responsibility to be examined. Naomi lay down later that night, knowing that she had done nothing extraordinary, only what she had learned to do long ago, to remain composed, to trust timing, and to allow truth to arrive without forcing it. And in that quiet understanding rested the final echo of justice, not loud or dramatic, but steady and enduring, a reminder that when power misjudges dignity, it is dignity, patient and unwavering, that ultimately corrects the balance.